Next presentation from our friends at Tusculum. Before us is going to be Associate Professor Kelsey Traum of the English department at Tusculum, where she's also the writing program coordinator and faculty vice chair, the editor of the Tusculum Review, and an in-house international literary journal, which is the International Literary Journal. And also with us is Dr. Michelle Temple, who is the counselor and ADA coordinator at Tusculum, who specializes in vocational rehabilitation and mental health counseling in community and higher education settings. And the third panelist today is a student, Elizabeth Masson-Gill. And I'm really excited about our first student to join in, and we appreciate you guys' partnership, and we look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Music. So I'm really pleased to have Elizabeth here with us today, and she really is the star of this show, so I'll try to get to her quickly. She is a freshman at Tusculum University, and she's going to read about midway through our presentation today. I have a family member who's been sober for 2 decades. He doesn't say he's in active recovery, although he is. He calls it working the steps. In my sport, which is swimming, if our coach gives us 100 to do between hard sets, and she tells us to aim for active recovery pace, what she means is that it's not an easy or a cool down, that there's more coming. So we're not supposed to get too relaxed. That seems like a pretty good description of where we're at as academics. There's more coming. We have not always done what was required to connect the real problems in our communities with the collaborative solutions that academia at its best can offer. Last summer and fall, after the death of George Floyd and the amplification of the Black Lives Matter movement, many of us, especially those of us in academia who are white, took a stunned look at the racial homogeneity of the writers and scholars on our syllabi, looked around at the startling whiteness in our own departments, and scrambled to provide voices of color in authoritative roles for our students. We academics are in active recovery too, I think. We should continue the work we've already begun in expanding the stories told and voices heard within our disciplines by recognizing the need to feature narratives of substance abuse, of the sexual vulnerability and predation that often accompany addiction, and of the way narcotics function within our communities and those elsewhere. And we should enable students to write about these elements of their experience. So when I heard about this conference, I thought of all the writing about their own substance abuse and that of their family members and friends that students in my composition and creative writing classes had done over the years. And I was pretty shocked to realize that there were many columns of students who had done so that I could remember. I had never suggested it as a topic, but they had written about it because they needed to, because it was central to their lives, and because I hope they felt safe sharing it with me. How had I made them feel safe? I wasn't entirely sure. I sometimes reference the inspiration I take from watching the sober alcoholic in my own family approach challenges with humility and serenity. I'll tell students things I've learned from him and other sober friends about the 12 steps. I let students know that I love and respect people who've grappled with substance abuse, that a complicated history need not be a secret or a source of shame. When I introduce assignments like writing an informal letter to someone, I include in the list of potential recipients loved ones in rehabilitation programs and incarcerated friends and family members. I think, if nothing else, I have normalized the realities of how substance abuse and recovery intersect with and sometimes animate and enhance all of our lives. The students coming to our institutions have sometimes been performing writing and study for teachers and tests, so I think it's important we step back and teach students that writing isn't merely a performance and product, that it's a way for them to communicate first with themselves. And they can do this in journals and free writing and in-class activities, then with intimates and colleagues in letters and emails, and finally with a larger audience, either through publication or academic essays. In Composition 1, when they begin brainstorming topics for their narrative essays and choose moments to describe, I remind them that readers are less interested in stories of easy success, much more moved by struggle. It's trouble and failure we relate to. I tell them, don't tell the story that makes you look good. As author Lacey M. Johnson wrote in her Tin House essay called Unlikability, the truth is sometimes I'm afraid of what I write. You should be a little afraid of the story you are telling too. And if you're not afraid that someone won't like it, you're still not telling the truth. Sometimes moving into personal writing quickly is a good way to prevent their filtering instincts from kicking in. And once you've got them immersed in scene creation, in showing, not telling, they're much closer to recreating the emotional truth of their experience for themselves and readers. They begin to feel the utility of writing for themselves. But writing about trauma and addiction are potentially dangerous. Dr. Temple will talk more about negotiating those challenges. So what does literature have to offer the conversation about substance abuse? I think everything. In the chat, you'll find a list of substance abuse. I actually listed shorter pieces like essays and short stories, because what I'm going to show you now in this PowerPoint is primarily novels and longer works. But there's such a wide plethora of things out there, many of which people have mentioned already. But I think I have a few things to add. So let me share this and show you some highlights. So I think using addiction narratives in class can sometimes be exhausting because some of them are quite harrowing. And sometimes students are stunned by the things that they encounter. So I think a good place to start in a more general education course, especially if you're just looking for one book to choose, is a music memoir. And before I talk about this, I should step back a little and say that while I think it would be really valuable to have one class on addiction, as other people have spoken about, and as I aim to do here as well, I think it's important for us to think about incorporating these narratives into all of our courses. So it can be a small thing that you incorporate into a pre-existing class syllabus. And this particular memoir by Nile Rodgers, I think, would be an ideal choice. Music memoirs, I think, are good introductions to the literature of addiction narratives because they also involve so much more than just addiction. So for instance, in this Nile Rodgers one, addiction is a central part of this. And there is the redemptive element of his recovery, but he also includes so much about his artistic development as a child and his childhood and his family life, etc., that it doesn't feel overtaken by the addiction element of it. I also think that musicians are poets, so naturally their prose is sometimes quite nice. So Nile Rodgers of Le Chic, he was also a producer he is also a producer who produces people like Madonna and David Bowie, etc. This is another good one that I've included portions of in some classes, Duff McKagan of Guns N' Roses. And this is a quite nice memoir. Students are often interested in reading about the lives of star musicians as well. Drinking a Love Story is a classic and one that I've included portions of in some classes. She's a journalist, so of course a good writer. And here's some other people who are known primarily as, in Mary Karr's case, a poet, and then The Night of the Gun, David Karr is a journalist, classics of the genre, I think. But I think we should also think about other addictive behaviors beyond alcohol and narcotic use. And college is usually a prime time for students to begin or continue having eating disorder problems. So I think addiction memoirs that are based in eating disorders are also a good idea. This is a really good one, Roxane Gay's Hunger, Mariah Hornbacher's Wasted. And both of these acknowledge how some addictive behaviors begin with sexual trauma and how people in addictive environments are sometimes more sexually vulnerable to sexual predation, etc. Also, Not All Black Girls Know How to Eat is a good one. And I want to say a little bit more about eating disorders and how students should feel liberated to talk about those. Traditionally, I think we've assumed that it was mostly girls who were afflicted by eating disorders. And at my university, I see many men, especially athletes, afflicted by them as well. So there are a lot of narratives of male eating disorders out there too that we should check out. And I think also it's important as a faculty member, while maintaining boundaries, to let your students know that you have sometimes made yourself vulnerable and talked about the addictive habits that you've overcome. So a few years ago, Dr. Michael Bodery of our English department, he edited with students a collection called Voices of Tusculum, which was a series of essays written by people who were employed at Tusculum about their college experiences. And many of them revealed things about addictive behaviors or problems that they had struggled with. And I wrote an essay about my disordered eating in college at the University of Virginia. And after reading that and editing that essay, the student who was assigned to it, Taylor, she told me that she amped up the reality in the essay that she wrote for that collection. So I think our willingness to be vulnerable and write about our own imperfections is a way to model that for students as well, while maintaining boundaries being a really crucial part of that. Kate also mentioned Kiese Lemon's Heavy, which is probably one of the favorite books that I've read in the past couple of years. And if it seems like too much to read with your students an entire book about eating disorders, you can choose one from a collection that's about that subject. This is a really nice one, Going Hungry. Latria Graham has a really great essay in there. And she's someone who's interesting to read just on the subject of hiking in Appalachia, especially as a Black person. The Best American series, Best American Mystery Stories, Best American Short Stories, Best American Essays, Best American Poetry, those always have good stuff about substance abuse disorders. So I'd really recommend that you take a look at those every year. On the novel end, some of these can be quite harrowing, and none of these in particular have I read with students. In fact, I'm not sure how I would handle them in the classroom. Cost in particular is a really tough one. Louise Erdrich often writes about addiction. She's a North Dakota author, and she often writes about addictive behaviors, especially on Native American reservations. Trainspotting is a really good one that I read in college. And I remember that the students who presented on that one, who were leading the discussion that day, they came in and sat empty beer cans on the table, which indicates that they kind of didn't get the point of this narrative. But these are all really good novels that can be taught on the literary level and also give us an opportunity to talk about addiction with our students. It was interesting that someone earlier brought up noir as a genre, and I was thinking about that too. Some of these are not terribly realistic, but some of them do include accurate and realistic depictions of addiction, especially in these particular locations. So I think it would be interesting to look at more pop culture or pulpy representations of addiction. I think that's a worthwhile conversation. We also publish an international literary journal here called the Tusculum Review. And as part of that, we have a contest every year. This year it was for creative nonfiction. And our judge, David Lazar, chose Jamie L. Smith's essay, Mythology Lessons, which is in part about addiction. And she came and did a reading for our launch. We are unfortunately out of copies, but we may do a second printing, in which case you can check out our website and obtain one there. And if you just want to email me and let me know that you saw us at this conference, I'll send you a free copy. So I think the more you can let your students know that addiction narratives and reflections on addiction are an important part of literature, the more they'll feel comfortable about their own experiences with that. Just one thing real quick that I want to cover before I get to Elizabeth. A lot of people have mentioned that at their universities, they team teach classes on addiction from multidisciplinary perspectives. And I think that's wonderful. We have not done that here, but we have done that on other subjects. And I wanted to show you an example that was really successful. So Afrofuturism, which is a literary and cultural movement that imagines the survival and flourishing of people of the African diaspora into a technological future. And I looked at that in the class that I taught primarily from a literary angle, but I had guest speakers come in and talk about Afrofuturism through other lenses as well. In part, I did that because I'm a white person and I wanted there to be authoritative voices of a variety of ethnic backgrounds talking about this subject, but also in part because I think different disciplines do have so much more to bring to every subject. And this was by far the most successful class I've ever taught, the one in which I learned the most and the one in which students were most engaged. So this is the cover of Ytasha Womack's book, Afrofuturism, which is kind of the text, the critical text of this particular movement. And she generously agreed to come, which was pretty astounding. And on the list of resources that I put in the chat, you can click on the lecture that she gave, as well as all the rest that I'm going to show you. Dr. Jeff Perry, who teaches at Tusculum, he came and talked about the Middle Passage and American slavery. Dr. Michelle Temple, who you'll speak with in a moment, came and talked about epigenetics, and you can watch her lecture here. It was really fascinating. And Maurice Walker, my childhood friend and kind of graphic novel aficionado, came and talked about Black comics and Black comic book creators, Black characters in superhero narratives. And Amy Sturgis, who is a scholar of the intellectual history of Native Americans, she came and talked about indigenous futurism, which was related to Afrofuturism. So I think that something really similar on the subject of addiction could be really powerful. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Dr. Temple to you, but first, I'm going to introduce our guest star, which is Elizabeth Massengill. She's a freshman student at Tusculum University, and she was in my Composition 1 course last semester. The very last assignment in the semester was the This I Believe essay, which I'm sure some of you have taught before. And I was really blown away by this essay, and she has very generously agreed to come and read it for you.
Hi everyone. I'm Elizabeth. I do attend Tusculum University. This essay was something that was it was almost hard to write because I didn't realize I remembered a lot of the details of the day I'm about to tell you. It does involve me speaking about my mother, who did recently pass away. So hopefully, if I do get upset or tear up, it will not bring you any discomfort. Okay. I titled this "You Throw Away Trash, Not People." Being someone who is a magnet for damaged goods, I have seen my share of people destroying themselves and others to feel in control. There is a plethora of people who have the mindset that a certain situation or feeling is what defines their lives, including myself. I can still recall moments in my own life where I was at a standstill within my own mind. I felt what I went through or was going through was what would dictate how others saw and treated me. That was never the case in most circumstances, even after I made known the darkest parts of myself. Not one person is disposable, no matter how you may view yourself. My mother never lived a simple or easy life. She endured countless episodes of trauma and pain, and unfortunately, a lot of that was passed on to my brother Philip and me. For most of my childhood, she abused all of her prescriptions, most of which should have never been used together when my cousin Lara had to come live with us. She had to care for Philip and me when she just graduated high school. She woke us up, fed us, took us to school, helped with our chores, and made sure my mother was just asleep instead of dead. I could not tell you the number of times that had to be checked. My mother was practically a breathing corpse. I was 6 years old when my mother forgot who I was. It was late in the evening. My brother and I were either yelling or playing, either is probable, in the dining room when Lara told us to go to the back bedroom. I do not remember questioning it. I just remember following my brother as I always did. It felt like forever when Lara finally came back to get us. Your mom isn't feeling good, okay? So I want you guys to come in here and see her before you go to bed, but she may not remember you, she said as we were walking towards the living room. As a 6-year-old, I was forced to understand what no kid should have. Why would my own mother not remember me? The answer to that was a very complex yet simple. She had a seizure. I can recall walking in the living room behind Lara and Philip because I was scared. When I walked in, I could see the glossiness and confusion in her eyes. I also remember asking who she was and how fast Lara suggested I should go to bed when my mother didn't even look at me. Years later, I still worry that when she does not answer me, it is because she cannot remember who I am. Sorry. Thankfully, that has not been the case since, but the fear is still there. She has done many things to make me question where I stand as her daughter, but she has never done anything to make me believe that she is disposable. There are days when I cannot talk to my mom because of how emotionally exhausting it is. As selfish as that sounds, I have learned that sometimes I need to just take care of myself. She would get so upset with me and guilt trip me, and it never worked out for either of us because the conversation always ended in hostility. I've learned to love her deeply over the years, but I've also learned to love her from a distance. It is not selfish to take care of yourself some days. It is not rude to not want to speak to someone who mentally drains you. It is necessary to work on yourself for yourself. She had come to the idea that she is disposable because of that. She does not deserve to be thrown out. I could easily stop speaking to her. I could give up every good memory to rid myself of all the bad ones, but that is not who I am. She has her reasons as to why she acts the way she does, and although I do not understand them, there are still reasons to her. Her mistakes, her past, does not define who she is, and they do not define the way I see her. Forgiveness goes hand in hand with this mentality. Once you accept the simple idea of forgiveness, it is easy to notice just how deserving everyone is of that forgiveness. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing your story with the conference attendees today, as well as with me. And as I share my portion of today as the ADA coordinator and mental health counselor at Tusculum, I'm here to help think of other considerations as we look at addiction narratives, substance use narratives in the humanities. So as you see on the screen, some general considerations as students are in courses writing about their addiction narratives. It's important to remember, as you may have heard today, is that there is substantial research that suggests that addiction experiences are embedded in trauma. And so any faculty member who chooses to consider incorporating addiction narratives in their course should also approach it from a trauma-informed manner. So that's bullet 2. So consider inviting the psychology department or the counseling department to come and talk to your classes about the multiple perspectives of therapy and understanding of addiction. And then this last bullet, I think, is just good writing in general as students consider their own narratives, or if it's a fiction course, that faculty require students to situate their narratives within the body of knowledge of substance use disorders and treatment. There we go. And so there are some perspectives that I think they were discussed a little bit. I didn't see all of the speaker right before this talk's presentation today. But I think it's important that as faculty are working with students in writing narratives about substance use disorders, addiction, addicts, that faculty themselves are cognizant of the various perspectives within the field of addiction treatment, so that they can help students write from not only from personal experiences, but also from a knowledge base. And I think it's also, as I go through this, helpful for faculty to have this information during discussions so that they can help students understand the multiple perspectives that might come up amongst their peers as they're listening to each other's narratives and providing their feedback. So the first bullet talks about the moral failure compared to the disease model. And so as we think about moralization, what we talk about in the field of substance use treatment is moral failure basically puts converts this idea of using a substance as an inability to live by a certain set of values and beliefs. So it's the idea of good and bad. And the disease model of addiction looks at it as a severe chronic stage of a substance use disorder where a person has substantial loss of control. And it's also considered almost a compulsive use of a drug or a substance. There's usually a presumption about the disease model that a person likely wants to stop using. And so as you listen to many students' narratives, especially as the research has increased on trauma-informed care, there's this other voice that's not on the slide that really talks about there's this blend of the moral and the disease model that begins to hopefully destigmatize the challenges that not only the individual who uses substances face, but sometimes it's called carnage, the carnage of lives that are also affected by someone who is either an active user or if they have a history of use and they're currently in recovery. The other bullet point that I think faculty should make sure they're cognizant of is related to treatment, right? So the first is, how does someone come to use moral failure compared to disease? And the second is, how does someone move through recovery? And those are harm reduction model and abstinence. So you probably already heard about this, but it's just helpful to hear. This idea of harm reduction implies that a person can engage in some form of use in a way that reduces harm or engage in other behaviors that are comparable and not as harmful. Whereas abstinence is exactly what it sounds like, and it's typically a 12-step model of treatment, suggesting that a person never uses. So you can think of harm reduction as someone who uses alcohol, suggesting that they can have one drink, but no more. And then abstinence model is not using at all. And so as you engage in writing narratives, whether fiction or nonfiction with students, I would just encourage you to make sure your students, as they write their personal experience, especially, use the knowledge base of substance use disorder to help them build a robust narrative that really speaks to not only their experience, but potentially a broader audience. So that's all I wanted to share with you today.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for this helpful presentation. I mean, great resources, great collaboration, but also Elizabeth, I know that I speak for every panelist here. Thank you so much for leading in vulnerability and your just a gift for writing, but also I just want to take a moment and hold space for your mom and honor the complexity of her life. So Elizabeth, I really, really appreciate you very much. And our friends from Tusculum, thank you so much for sharing with us today. But now we will quickly transition over into our next speaker. And